Be the Talk, episode 220, featuring Steve Rohr. Welcome to Be the Talk. We go behind the talk 7 days a week for tips and techniques to help you change the world. I'm Nathan Eckel, and a talker myself. I'm interviewing others who change the world with their talk. You can too, even if you've never given a talk before. Let's get started with today's show. We are live with Steve Rohr. Steve, are you ready to talk?
Well, that's what this show is about, and I'm really happy to be here, Nathan, because it was flattering to get your note and then our back and forth a little bit, and I love what you're doing.
All right. Well, Steve Rohr is a TEDx Fargo alumnus and a communication expert. You can find out more about Steve Rohr at realsteverohr, ROHR.com. Steve Rohr, welcome to the talk.
Thank you so much.
So your TEDx Fargo talk is called How on Earth Do You Matter? And this is the most epic talk because you're talking about it's one of these science things in the universe and the light years and how small and tiny and insignificant you are. And then Steve goes ahead and he pivots Talk Universe. He pivots over to the Cold War of all things. And then, in Talk Universe by now, if you've listened to a bunch of these, you know that I'm a classically trained musician. So Steve starts talking about Van Cliburn winning the Cold War back in whenever it was in the 50s, in the middle of all of that. So, that's a little bit of a lead in, but Steve, please take us behind the talk.
Well, you know, Van Cliburn is known to a generation of people. He was really a rock star, as you know. He was the only, I think, musician to ever get a ticker tape parade in New York City. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was really up there with Elvis, and that's very hard for a lot of people to grasp right now. But it was really a defining moment in the Cold War era where he went in and really melted the hearts of the Russian people, and they embraced him, and he became the ambassador for the U.S. in a sense musically, and went on to, very prestigious career. But the point really with illustrating Van Cliburn was about how mentorships really works and how people don't just pop out of nowhere. We all come from some place, and someone saw us at some point and said, "Hey, maybe you could do this." And with Van Cliburn, it was his mother. And then I got really interested in how does this kid from small town Texas change the course of geopolitical history? And his mom actually took lessons from someone who took lessons from somebody who took lessons from somebody. And you keep going back in history and you run into these really big names.
Well, it's all the way up to Franz Liszt
Bach.
or even beyond. Yeah, Bach.
Oh, yeah.
Bach. Now, way back upline from Liszt. Yeah.
Right. So back to the 1600s. So along the way from student to teacher, I found it really fascinating and really illustrates the power of mentorship and how one person can open the door. Well, or in the case I talked about, be the door for someone.
Well, absolutely. And that was a piece that I forgot, just because we had a little bit of delay in finally connecting. But I'm so glad you brought that up, Steve, because I used to do that. That's what you do when you're in classical music as a student, and you whether you're a violinist, you can probably trace your lineage back to Paganini. If you're a pianist like I was, it was, I think I could get all the way to Beethoven. But I mean, Liszt is in the downline of Bach, and that was such a cool piece. And now today we see, whether it's art, in Impressionism or music or new forms of music or even, internet marketing, we all have levels of mentorship and broadcasting. We all have, people that we look up to. And so you really rightfully show us the kind of the ultimate downline of the impact that you can have. And it's not just about the up chain or the down chain. It's about the legacy that's being imparted, even as the instrument, in this case, the piano, evolved from a harpsichord and a little wimpy, plucking instrument into a modern day, 12-foot, concert grand Steinway piano, for example.
Well, absolutely. And I love how you talk about the legacy because that's really what it is. And it's not just one person doing their job of opening the door or seeing the next person through. It's really a whole series of people have to get this right. And when you think about it, it's really delicate. if one of those people had not seen or mentored one of those people along the way, the chain would have been broken. Now, maybe it would have been picked up someplace else along the way, but the fact is you can actually trace it back from student to teacher all the way to the Bach family. And that's an extraordinary thing. And again, like you said, this happens throughout industry, so you mentioned marketing, you mentioned art. So again, it goes back to the idea that one person does matter along the way, but it takes this legacy of people to do their job to result in what we have today, some pretty extraordinary people.
Well, Steve, some would say, even beyond, but then again, your talk, Talk Universe, you watch Steve's talk, it goes from micro to macro down to micro again. So I'm going to go macro here. Some would say, listening to this, they're thinking about some endangered sparrow somewhere in South America, that the rainforest is being chopped down, and that little sparrow is going to be next on the hit list. And that's a disconnection. Some would say, the art. I remember, the Gulf War, or the whatever it was called a few years ago, and then the Babylonian sculptures were being destroyed and trashed. And then you do that, and that's a disconnection from all of that amazing history. And for future people who will have maybe the equivalent in the future of our modern day DNA technology to now, things that they could do in the future to come back to the present day and do things that we couldn't imagine, that's all being cut off when these things are happening. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely, I agree. And it goes back to the idea of the ecosystem, how fragile it can be and how interconnected we all are, not just people, but all beings and all things. And so one thing gets off track, and then suddenly it does have this ripple effect. And when we're talking about people, you don't feel so alone then when you consider that you're all connected. You're all connected in some way, shape, or form. There is that idea of the 6 degrees of separation. I didn't talk about that in my TED Talk, but it really is that universal truth that somehow we can get to everybody along the way. And my fate, your fate are interconnected. And what I do in my life does have some value, because I have looked up into the world, into the big universe, and thought, my God, I'm nothing. I am a speck. And it's a little depressing, to be honest. And you feel like, well, why the heck am I cleaning up my kitchen right now? I'm like, why am I doing this right now? Why does this matter at all? And then I'm trying to figure that answer out. And that's what I was attempting to do in my TEDx talk, which is a huge mammoth undertaking, but I did it in my own kind of way, in the way that I understood my own experience. So it was really about, okay, I am part of this bigger thing, this bigger legacy along the way. And it really stemmed from a student that I've been mentoring for many, many years, and how he came into my path. And I never wanted kids. I don't think the government would allow it at this point, but or anybody else, quite frankly, but the joke is, and what I say to him, he's, the son I never wanted. Oh. I was his teacher at community college, and I was the professor who just never went away. I'm sure it's terribly annoying for him that, here I am still showing up years later. So I gave a TEDx talk.
That sounds like the zombie professor.
Oh,
that's what that sounds to me. You just, they hack off one of your limbs and you climb back and crawl back after them.
I will grow back. I will haunt you forever. I'm not a mentor. I'm a tormentor is really what it comes down to. So his name is Steven. He grew up here in Los Angeles. I was his speech teacher, and I followed him around for all these years, and he's done an extraordinary job with his life. So he's gone from being a first-generation college student to going on a speech scholarship to the University of Texas, and now he's at USC in the master's program for communication, which is #1 in the world. So I gave the TEDx Fargo closing speech last year, and he gave the opening this year. And I tell you, you've given a great TEDx talk, and the only thing
from one closer to another. Because exactly. I close mine too. We'll talk about closing. Yeah.
So that was a pretty, amazing honor. But I'm telling you, Nathan, something bigger is watching this student giving his interpretation of the world so far and his experience so far. And that it really was much more of a proud moment for me. And he did a wonderful job this year. And TEDx Fargo, if people are not familiar with it, it's huge. It's huge. We had 2,100 people last year. There were 2,400 this year.
I mean, how many people are in Fargo? How many people are in North Dakota? 2,500, right?
Well, I'm telling you, it's a whole event. So the president of Microsoft spoke. The publisher from Forbes spoke. The governor was the closing speaker this year. He's come every year, sat in the front rows. It's a very big
president of Microsoft event. Flies into Fargo. Wow.
Well, here's an interesting bit of trivia. Fargo has the second largest Microsoft campus in the country.
Oh, no idea.
Exactly.
Had so absolutely no idea.
Fargo is this kind of what you see on television. It is not. They don't really talk like that. They do, but they don't.
Well, they had a movie too. They had
I can't even watch their show.
That was kind of a dark noir movie, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it is, and it feels very small town, and there is a small town hospitality feel, but it's cool. So you've got coffee shops, and you have microbreweries, and you've got great food, and you have tech. All of these incredible things are happening in Fargo, North Dakota. People really have no clue. So my student who spoke, he flew in. He's not really expecting much, I'll be honest. He went, to school in Austin, and he gets there and he says, "This is a cleaner Austin." I said, "Yes, it is. It's really on the cusp." And what they've done there is absolutely extraordinary. It's a community event and one that's growing. They'll have to move venues, I'm sure, next year. Because
Powerful
there's
stuff.
So many people. They're turning away volunteers. They've turned away hundreds of volunteers. That's crazy.
That is crazy.
And they're wonderful people. So I had a great time.
Talk Universe, that doesn't usually happen, even with branded organizations.
Yeah.
They usually don't have to turn away volunteers. That is very, very unusual. So we're talking to Steve Rohr here. His talk is called How on Earth Do You Matter? And it's really about how you do matter. And it's really about, I'm going to put the cap on this, see if you agree. When I started studying chaos theory, it's really about chaos theory. It's about how, how order turns into chaos, and chaos can be simplified into order. And the universe is so big, yet your life is so significant.
Yeah, and I think I had to give this speech for myself in some ways. And it goes back to the idea that we were talking about before, that you could wander around the world, the planet, and not feel really good about yourself or anything that you're doing. We get very isolated and insulated in our own lives, and we think these kind of things that we're doing day to day are very important. And then you look outside and you see the stars and you think, wait a second, not so much. And we have such a short time on Earth. This feels like a downer. It feels like a downer because really, in the grand scheme of things, you're here for a blip. So how on earth are you going to matter? And that was the question I wanted to answer, and wanted to do it through my own lens. And the way I answered it was, do your part. Do your part. Mentor somebody. Find a way to pass on what you know. Help people avoid mistakes along the way. And then you're gone. But whatever you've passed on, hopefully continues to survive and thrive.
So we've been talking to Steve Rohr. His talk, again, is called How on Earth Do You Matter? We're going to be right back in just a moment with the Blitz Round. People ask, how could I start a 7-day-a-week podcast? It's because of what I've learned from my mentors. Some of the best mentors in history aren't around anymore. They've left hours of one-on-one mentoring behind in their books. Each month at Classics on Tap, I record a new chapter from a classic business book to help you make a difference. Download your first chapter at classicsontap.com. And we're back with the Blitz Round with Steve Rohr. His talk from TEDx Fargo is called How on Earth Do You Matter? I'm about to ask Steve a few either-or questions related to the preparation and performance of his recent talk. Steve, are you ready?
Oh, boy. Okay.
All right. So, first question, did you apply or were you selected?
I was selected, and that was a huge thing. I had been told that I should probably give a talk, and I love TED Talks and I love TEDx Talks. I'm obsessed with them. but I never really pursued it. And fortunately, somebody pursued me, and that was quite something.
Awesome. So, in terms of your approach, are you an improviser, a memorizer, or a blender?
Well, I definitely memorize, but I memorize so much that I can stray and be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that words are used intentionally. And so I am very much obsessed with making sure that whatever word I'm using is the right word. And so I will spend way too much time, I watched, my family grew up around me as I did this, but it was very important that every word that I spoke was the one I wanted.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah. So, now what's a tip, a technique, or a tool that helped you?
Well, I think you get everything out on a piece of paper. That's number one. You get everything out. You don't censor yourself. You don't judge yourself. What do I want to share? What do I want people to hear from me? And when they walk away, what do I want them to carry with them when they go? And so that's where I started. And the second thing is I always do this. I write a speech to be said, not to be read. So I wrote a book on public speaking called Scared Speechless. And that's one of the big rules. We write these speeches like essays. We get up and they sound exactly like an essay, and it sounds like we're reading. And speaking is very different. So I would just get up and run some thoughts and see how it played to myself.
Yeah.
And it's okay to do that.
Talk Universe. Crazy. Yeah. That makes a big difference. You've got to write it the way that you're going to speak it, or else you're going to have some problems.
That's right.
And that's why I always practice reading the bios before I do these. You guys don't hear that on the podcast unless you watch me do that on the live talk show broadcast. But that's a really important principle. It will mess you up. They're two different domains. Now, Steve, back to you. Let's put our closer hat on, because I closed, you closed. I'm glad you mentioned that. What advice do you have for not just everybody out there, but some of you Talk Universe, you're going to be honored. Some of you are going to be openers, which is an incredible honor. And then some of you are going to be, if you're really, really prepared also, you're going to be asked to be a closer like Steve. What's your advice for closers?
Well, I shouldn't probably have been the closer, because they had already lined up all the speakers by the time they asked me. And they said, hey, you can either have 5 minutes this year or 12 minutes next year. And I said, I'll take the 5 minutes. And then a few weeks later, they said, hey, by the way, you're going to be closing this thing. Okay.
Did that put the fire under your seat like it did to me? What was your reaction when they tell you that?
You're thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe I should start thinking about what I'm going to be talking about and not put this off. And really giving people something that they can walk out the door with. Because as you know, by the time you get to the closing speaker, people are really emotionally, mentally exhausted, physically exhausted from sitting in those chairs.
Yeah.
And they've been running this gauntlet of ideas. And boom, 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 boom. So you have to give them something that's going to be a little different.
Now, how many speakers did they have at Fargo?
24.
Wow. So that's a lot of speakers. That's a lot. There are some that do even more than that, but 24 is a lot. It's a lot. It's a long day.
Yeah. And so I don't think I gave a traditional TEDx talk. I really didn't. I told 4 or 5 stories, and I'm big on patterns and symbolism. And so I wanted to share some stories, because I thought by the time they get to me, they're not going to want to hear about too many big numbers or facts or figures. They want to hear about life.
Yeah.
They want to hear about something that they can relate to, and maybe tie all these other speakers' ideas and thoughts together. One thing that was very important to me, and this is a nuts and bolts kinds of thing, is not to get too exhausted. If you're going to sit there and watch all of those speakers, well, be prepared to be exhausted, because just like the audience, not only are you being inundated with these brilliant ideas, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm up in 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, and it becomes this this bigger than life thing. So
well, and to tie it back with our interview with Steve and his talk, which we talked about music a lot, for those of you that took violin lessons or piano lessons and it was time for the violin recital, if you're like me, you wanted to be first. Because then your problem was you're trying not to sleep because the whole emotional mental thing and you're exhausted. And then your big problem is boredom for the rest of the day and being stuck there in the front row of the church that the recital is done in or whatever. If you're last, you've got this cascading. It's like a cascading. I don't want to say a panic attack, but I mean, it's something that needs to be managed. So I will say that not to freak any of you out, but if you just sat and didn't listen to this podcast and know what to expect, for those of us that are, prone to being normal humans, prone to a little bit of justifiable anxiety, it's kind of a snowballing, cascading thing unless you listen and do what Steve is about to tell you right now. So back over to you.
Part of you wants to be very polite and you want to be respectful for other speakers, but you don't have that luxury because your entire job is to get up there and do the best you can.
Yeah.
Not be polite to the other speakers. Your job is to deliver the best talk you can possibly give. So
and just I'm gonna jump in there because I don't think there's anything impolite to giving other people their space backstage in the green room or where they have
right.
And nobody should, if you're just kind of keeping to yourself and not being particularly disruptive or loud in the way that you're keeping to yourself, nothing impolite about that. But over to you. Just wanted to.
I love that.
So
find your own space.
Yeah.
It's okay if you have headphones on. It's okay if you take a walk. It's okay if you go in and watch the first couple of speakers and then go back to the hotel and just whatever you have to do, or get to the arena or wherever you're going, a couple speakers ahead or 3 speakers ahead and listen to some of those great talks. But you don't have to sit through 24. You can always watch them online later and you won't be rude because again, your entire job is to deliver the best talk you can. And if you're exhausted, you're doing a disservice to yourself and to the audience.
Yeah. Well, and just like Steve says, we're going to wrap up in just a moment here with the final word of advice. But, just like Steve says, I mean, all these talks are up on YouTube. So please don't, understand. I think the big piece of this Blitz round is that, know that you are in a different category. You don't need to be also a participant as well as a speaker. Stay in the speaker lane, manage your energy. Do not feel beholden to have to do all this extra stuff. I could tell you a story about emceeing recently my little brother's wedding reception and being stuck in the house all day with my small nieces and nephews who are, I think, 8 or 9 that I have at this point. Don't do what I did that day when I was feeling guilty about staying in the house all day and they get up at the crack of dawn and the wedding isn't even until the late afternoon and you realize, no, do the smart thing, be polite, have a sense of the protocol, but that's why you're listening to this podcast right now. The protocol is not that you have to sit in the front row and pay attention and take notes on the other 23 speakers. The protocol is find your own space, know when you need to be in that green room, do not impose, add value to the other people, help the staff, help the volunteers, and, like we say, put on your own airplane air mask first. Just be that person. Put your own mask on first so that you have the air so that you can be useful and not pass out and be part of the burden.
Yeah, if you pass out, then, all bets are off at that point. It's about self-care. Really take care of yourself.
Absolutely.
And so get some sleep if you can. Don't drink excessively and don't do all those things that you normally do on a Tuesday.
Don't do that.
It's kind of an athletic event. So take care of yourself.
All right. Well, we've been enjoying this talk with Steve Rohr. You can find out more about him at our show notes page at www.BeTheTalk.com. You can go to real Steve Rohr, ROHR.com, realsteverohr.com, and see his talk, How on Earth Do You Matter? And in a moment, we're going to be back with Steve Rohr for the final word of advice for Talk Universe. Everyone wants to change the world, but not everyone knows the first step. Before you can change the world with your talk, it has to be selected. So grab the templates, timelines, and tools that I use to get my talk selected at BeTheTalk.com. And we're back with Steve Rohr. It is time for the final word of advice.
Have fun. Have fun. A lot of us have dreamed of doing this for many, many years. And then we start psyching ourselves out and we play mind games. Well, it's about having fun and sharing your idea. And if you can really dial into the idea of fun, you'll be golden on that stage. You'll be absolutely golden.
Talk Universe, have fun. Steve Rohr, thank you so much for coming on the talk today and sharing your wisdom with Talk Universe.
Thank you, Nathan. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Be the Talk. For tips and resources to help you change the world, go to BeTheTalk.com. See you tomorrow.